So let's get going because it's 7 o'clock and quite a little bit to get through. I'm not sure whether I'm going to do any questions today. I think I didn't have time to do a proper kind of Twitter thread like I would probably normally do for this sort of thing. So I'm probably going to do that at the weekend and then probably do a longer session at the weekend. And so this is kind of a pre-release tool. So between now and the weekend, that might also just allow a bit of an opportunity to get some feedback on it as well. Um, so if we just come out of there for a second and just kind of go to the tool itself. So in the tweet thread or on Facebook or in DNUK, I did put a link to download this pre-release tool. Please just take a second to go through the disclaimer because it is important. When people are modelling things for themselves, they obviously have the ability to get things very wrong. And, with any modelling, the golden rule is put rubbish in and you get rubbish out. But that said, we've been left in a dreadful situation by the pension scheme and government in forcing people to basically have to do these estimations this year. So I'm just going to kind of go over a little bit of kind of the history of why we're here, and then I'll come back to the modeler and talk you through it. So every year for the last 5 or 6 years, when there've been brown envelopes, so this was the last one in 21-22 because obviously there were no brown envelopes in 22-23 because of McLeod. I've always tried to do a Twitter thread to kind of help people navigate the mess. And the reason for the Twitter thread essentially is twofold. One was to kind of just help people navigate it, so what they actually need to do if they're trying to do this without an accountant, for example. But also crucially to kind of validate what's inside the brown envelope. I've been moaning to the scheme in England for 5 or 6 years now that they could do a lot more on the pension saving statements to try and flag whether or not the data that's been used to calculate it is wrong. So, for example, showing very simple things like the pensionable pay that they've based the figures on would give people an opportunity. But that unfortunately has fallen on deaf ears, and we are where we are with the scheme at the moment. But this year things are much worse because normally I would do tools to try and help you validate that the contents of your brown envelope is correct. But this year you have no brown envelope. So the law states that there's a statutory requirement for the schemes to produce pension saving statements for those that exceed the general annual allowance by October of each year after the tax year is closed. Obviously, October has expired now, and we're now mid-December. But it also states that those that request them should get one within 3 months. And it was only up until a week or two ago the scheme were just flatly refusing and saying, we're not accepting requests for on-demand statements, which is, again, just unprecedented poor service, in my opinion. But then we had another series of announcements last week, and there's a Twitter thread here covering it on the 10th of December if you go to my Twitter, Goldstone_Tony. And I'll just kind of cover the headlines that are just in this tweet here, essentially. So the BSA have said they're not expecting to produce pension saving statements on time, and that's kind of obvious because we're a long way after October. But I think they're saying that they're not expecting them to even produce them by the self-assessment deadline, which for the 23-24 tax year is, of course, the 31st of January 2025. Now, there's been lots of people trying to apply pressure to HMRC, myself, people in industry, BMA, other unions, schemes in multiple nations in the UK have all been trying to say to HMRC, this is not achievable without people having the data. And of course, there's precedent for that because the reason we didn't get brown envelopes last year was because of McLeod. And because of that, HMRC said, well, you've got no brown envelope. You don't know what's gone in the 7 years before because of McLeod. Therefore, we're not going to reasonably expect you to try and estimate what you owe. But they've decided not to do that this year. And they are still, as of today, and we hope that they will change their mind and see reason. They're still expecting you to self-assess by the 31st of January, and they're asking you to do that by estimating your pension growth, which of course is difficult at the best of times, but is exceedingly difficult for some people that have really got very little information, particularly the group that haven't even had a remedial pension saving statement yet. It becomes an almost impossible task, but I'll talk about that group separately in a minute. Ridiculously, in my opinion, again, the BSA have not provided any guidance at all on doing this. They send you to an HMRC page that literally provides no guidance at all on how to estimate your pension growth, and it's difficult to estimate your pension growth, and hence that's why I've kind of knocked together this tool to try and help people, initially just hospital doctors, to estimate their pension growth. What HMRC have said is that if you don't self-assess on time, you will still get a penalty in the normal manner. So people that haven't received the relevant paperwork, which is the vast majority of people, myself included, you're still expected to self-assess on time. And basically that means putting in an estimate. Now, importantly, they've said if your estimate is too low and you want to pay cash, i.e. via self-assessment, you'll be liable to interest. However, if your estimate is too low and you choose to use scheme pays, you will not be liable to interest. And that obviously this year really favours people putting in an estimate and then saying they're going to pay by scheme pays, and then if they think they've got some tax to pay, putting in a scheme pays application, which you've then got 4 years to change under the normal scheme pays rules. So I'm not going to go through that in any more detail, but you can read that Twitter thread. So the next bit is, are there any other tools or help out there? And the answer is it's really very limited. So the tool that I've done, that hopefully you've downloaded, covers both the 23-24 tax year, which is the tax year that you've got to self-assess for, but also the current tax year that we're in, 24-25, which you won't have to pay a tax charge until January 26. But because of the industrial action and the subsequent outcome that we got from that, and partial pay restoration, I won't call it a pay rise because I like to think of it as we've partially restored some of our lost pay rather than it being a genuine pay rise, that is going to cause very significant problems for some people. So I have included both 23-24 and 24-25 in this tool, and that's also allowed me to get some validation against the NHS employers and First Actuarial tool. And I work very closely with First Actuarial in the background on various scheme boards, and they're excellent. They advise the scheme, and I've got the utmost respect for them. So I have validated the 24-25 bit against this tool, because they don't unfortunately have the 23-24 bit. They did before October, but each year they replace it to make it the current tax year rather than the tax year that's due to be paid, unfortunately. So that puts people in a bit of a difficult position. I will say that originally I had intended that this tool was going to be for officers, i.e. hospital doctors in the 1995 or the 2008 scheme, and GPs. I did run into a problem with validation with the GP data, because my data was very different to the NHS employees data, and it turns out that my data was correct and theirs was incorrect, and I'm pleased to say that yesterday they've updated the practitioner bit, so GPs can still use this tool for getting the correct estimates for 24-25 growth, which obviously isn't needed for a while because of GP accounts, etc. So that will now correlate, and I'll probably release a practitioner version in the future. I'm just a bit undecided how to deal with some of the additional complexities which the NHS employees tool doesn't go into, things like taking into account pre-practitioner service, and I don't know how comfortable I am providing something that's not a more accurate estimate. So you will need some data to do this. So I'm just going to very quickly go through the data that you need. So as a bare minimum, really, most people will need a TRS. And so if I just hopefully bring up an example TRS. So this is a TRS for this year. And part of the reason that I delayed bringing this out until this week was because lots of people, including myself, who took industrial action, didn't have a TRS for this year because, again, ridiculously in my view, that they didn't plan for this. But anybody that took industrial action didn't have a TRS in the 23-24 tax year. But that's now been remedied. And for most people in England and Wales, they will have a TRS, and it's called an annual benefit statement in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. And these arrows point to either information that is needed for this modeler or to information that is used for validation. But essentially on the pension bit of TRS, you've got a 1995 or a 2008 section, depending which bit you're in, and that states pay. So this is really 1995 pay, or if you're in the 2008 scheme, this is something called reckonable pay, and I'll come back to that later. And in the 2015, this is actual pay. Now, for some people, like this member, those two figures are the same because this member is full-time, and so therefore their work time equivalent pay, which is what is used in the 1995 section, is the same as the 2015 scheme. So for full-time members who are otherwise straightforward and haven't had any gaps, etc., you can actually just use the payslip value, the March payslip value, to determine year-end pay in the relevant scheme year. But it's generally best to use the TRS figure. Now, this is the 23-24 TRS, and so crucially, this is post-rollback. So I've done lots of videos on McLeod. I'm not going to go into McLeod in any detail today, but basically, to remove the age discrimination for people that were affected by McLeod, they had to immediately remove the discrimination, and they did that by rolling everybody back into that old scheme. So on this 23-24 TRS, this shows the post-rollback reckonable membership. And if I was to show you the 22-23 TRS, then this would be 7 years less for a member that's been in the scheme full time. So instead of being 21,147, it would be 14,147. And similarly, in the 15 section, you can see that it shows the actual pensionable pay for the relevant years post rollback. Yeah, so this has got the 22/23 pay and the 23/24 pay, but nothing before that. On last year's TRS, the 22-23 TRS, that will have included all the pay from 15-16 through to the end of 22-23. Now, again, ridiculously in my view, in England and Wales, you can't access your previous TRSs. So when they upload it, they get rid of the previous version, and they've said the reason is it would cost too much and they don't have the storage to store them, which is a bit of a joke. But if you have accessed it previously, and if you don't know where it is, and I would advise everybody to every year access their TRS and email it to themselves or put it somewhere for safekeeping. But if you have accessed it, they are actually required by law to keep a copy of it. And therefore, if you request it, they will email you your previous TRS 22-23. And in the links, I've included just a very quick email that you can send to the scheme to get them to send you your previous TRS. You can download your current TRS, and if you haven't got your previous TRS, you can email it back, and they sent mine back in a few hours, which was excellent. So, this is also a template to request an on-demand pension saving statement. So, when we go through some of the numbers, you will realise, for example, if you're a consultant, especially in the 1995 scheme, that because of hard-fought changes to annual allowance, which you've all got the BMA to thank for, and to something called negative pension growth, the vast majority of you will not exceed the new annual allowance of £60,000. And that means they won't automatically send you a statement unless you ask for it. So I recommend that all high earners, and it's always a bit difficult to define high earners, probably anyone over 80 or 90 pensionable, I would say, definitely that lower value for people in the 2008 scheme. Every year I would just ask for a pension saving statement. So again, there's a link for that. So this is to request your on-demand statement, and the scheme have got 3 months by law to send it to you, because even if you've not got a pension tax charge this year, this information becomes very important for planning purposes for your annual allowance problem potentially for next year, and I'll talk about that in the modeler. Below that as well, that's just a sample email to get your historic TRS, which they will have only if you've accessed it. If you didn't download it last year, they won't be able to send it to you because they don't store it ridiculously. Yeah, I'll cover this when I come to the modeler, but just to kind of emphasise just how bad the situation potentially is for 24-25. Even the government have highlighted in their submission on the 10th of December to DDRB that tapering could cause massive problems this year. So they give an example where this consultant who's just gone to the top of the consultant pay scale, and because of the new scale, lots of people will jump to the top because it's gone from 19 down to 14 years. That will cause very large pension growth, which I'll show you in a minute. And the example that they give here is by non-pensionable pay going from 77,602 to 77,604 can cause the annual allowance charge to go up from £44,000 in this case to £66,000. So just process that. £2 more in pay if it's at that crucial level where your threshold income is 200k, can cause your annual allowance to go up by over £22,000. So a marginal rate of over 1,000,000%. And this is government's example, not mine, although I had previously produced a very similar example, I should say. And in fact, when DDRB came out with this on the 10th, I did point out that the figures didn't actually add up. They'd just made a simple typographic error. So again, really grateful that they corrected that last week, because I think it's really important that when even people in government advocating how bad the taper is, then we need to do something about it, because it could really cause an issue for winter pressures. And obviously we're in peak winter pressure at the moment with COVID and flu and noro and rota and everything else. This does not help the situation at all, and it would be great if the relevant minister, who's Tulip Siddiq, who we're meeting later in the month, takes that on board and provides some relief about that on the taper. But I will leave that one there. And yeah, I'll come to what I've put on my tax return after I've shown you the modeler. So let's just dive in and have a look at the modeler. And I'll use initially those values that we had on that slide. So I'll just go to that slide again, and then I'll come back to them in the modeler. So just going to go through the disclaimer in a little bit of detail. This is a pre-release version. I've rushed to get this out because people are rightly stressed and need to self-assess. It may contain errors. If it does, please just drop me a DM on Twitter, and I've opened my DMs so people can do that. And I will endeavour to correct it and keep this as up to date as possible. As with anything that you're doing yourself, it is absolutely not a substitute for formal financial advice or the advice of a qualified accountant. But what it is a tool to help you estimate it, and crucially also help you understand it, understand the interactions between inflation, changes to your pensionable salary, crucially trying to understand the tapering of the annual allowance so you're not stung by a huge unexpected charge, and of course tax. It's currently only for officer members of the 95 and 15 sections. It doesn't yet cover GPs. I can probably relax this 2008 bit now because I've now included a little bit so people can calculate their reckonable pay. And as I said before, rubbish in, rubbish out. Importantly, there's some links at the bottom. So as I said, for people that have got an RPSS, obviously it's important that you crack on with that and get the output of that, because one of the outputs from that is if you've got any carry forward from the end of the 22-23 tax year, which was included in that RPS process, because that feeds into this to give you a more accurate result. If you've not had an RPSS, then all I guess you could do is assume the worst case scenario that you would have a tax charge in the 22-23 tax year, and therefore you wouldn't have any carry forward. There's some links on there for my association with Forvis Mazars, and they can help you. And if you fail trials, you can get the full cost of that reimbursed by the government. There's also some links to pay scales. I don't think, as of today, the final 24-25 pay scales for NI have been published yet, but do please somebody correct me if I've got that wrong. And also the NHS Employees Ready Reckoner, which I showed before. And cells in yellow are cells to validate against TRS, and then cells in that cyan are to validate against TRS. So let's just jump into the 23-24, and these figures I've just got from this. So 21-147, 21-147, that's service. Important to check you've got the correct scheme here. So this was a 1995 member, but if you change that to 2008, all the multipliers and change and the wording changes to reflect reckonable pay rather than 1995 pay. So we've got these two values for 1995 pay from the relevant two TRSs. Because this is a full-time member and they're a hospital doctor and it's straightforward and they're full-time, these figures are the same as in 1995 pay equals 2015 pay. But generally you're best getting the pay from the relevant TRS from the 1995 section, because that shows you the figure that they've used for your work time equivalent pay for the calculations. So 136,532.27, so that's the value there for 23-24, and then on the other TRS, which I've not scanned in, 133,202.52 is in there. And then you should be able to validate that against the pension value from the relevant TRS. So this is a 23-24, and I'll just add the pence there just to show you that it's worked. So we can see 36,527.06, 36,527.06, but I'll take the pence off for now because we don't need pence. Now, by default, it's just set up so that the 2015 scheme pay equals these values up here. But that only works if you're full-time. And so you're generally best to get the 1995 bits from the 1995 bit of the TRS, or you could use a March payslip if you've not been sent a TRS and you're in the 1995 scheme and you're full-time. And these bits are from the 2015 bit of the scheme. And again, this could be validated, this figure for pension here inside. So 5281, we'll just add the pence, and 5281.23, 5281.23. So we've not entered that, that's calculated, so it just shows that everything is corrected. So I'm just going to change these figures to make them a little bit more realistic for a kind of typical mid-career consultant. So I think I did have a figure that was probably in the initial video, and I've just made that 25 years. So we've got pay that's kind of gone up by about 6% for that year, the 23-24 tax year, which I think was fairly typical. But what's allowable in the 23-24 tax year is 10.1%. Now, for people that follow me on social media for a long time, and particularly kind of back in the very early days in Doctors Net UK, for about 7 years, I've been going on about something that I call pension theft by not counting negative PIAs. And it really was a complete con that when our pension went down in real terms versus inflation, the scheme used to zero that off because that's what the rules said. And so we fought very hard for that to be changed. And for the first year, from 23-24, we now get negative pension growth counted in that legacy scheme. So in 23-24, when pay went up by around 6% on average, and it was allowed to go up by 10.1%, people will have large negative growth. So it means that you can use that minus 31 and offset it against this plus 40, so that the combined pension growth is only £9,000. And remembering also, as well as having negative pension growth, which we've fought hard for and won, from 23-24, we've also got the higher allowance of 60 and not £40,000. So what it means for this member is that they've now got £9,000 in that year, tested against an allowance of 60. So even if this member was tapered and I've given them a theoretical income of £210,000, then they don't meet the adjusted income limit, so that says false there. And even if they've got no carry forward from the RPSS process, and that's where you would enter any carry forward from the RPSS process, this member would not have a tax charge. And not only do they not have a tax charge, but they've also generated 50,890 carry forward through to the 24-25 tax year, which is great because that means that can offset a charge for next year. So for this member, for 23-24, they're they're home and dry. And so I'll show you what I've put on my actual tax return. This is from my actual tax return. So I've said, I've not received my statement despite asking for one. I do not anticipate that I will have a tax charge due to the higher allowance in 23-24, and I'm expecting negative growth in the 95 section to offset my 2015 growth. I therefore estimate my charge to be zero for the 23-24 tax year. But just as a proviso, because I've not been sent my scheme figures yet, when the scheme produces actual growth figures, I will recalculate and update my self-assessment if any changes are due. And if a charge is due at that time, it will be settled by scheme pays. And so I've just kind of put that in with the zero, because then that means I don't have to revisit my self-assessment because I'm expecting it to be zero. So it means I don't have to go back. So for example, if I had put a charge in, a theoretical charge of £1 or £25 or whatever, and then also put in a scheme pays, then that meant I would have had to have, gone and changed something. So I have done an estimate. These aren't my figures, but they mirror this, and for many consultants it will mirror this, and they will find in the 1995 scheme in particular that they don't have a charge for 23-24, but 24-25 could look very different. So let's go on to 24-25. So with 24-25, it's going to pull some through data from the previous tab. So that previous one was 25 years, 147 days, and that hasn't changed. The only circumstance that this would change is if you have added years. So, if you had bought, I'll just give a ridiculous example. So if you'd bought 5 added years over 20 years, that means each year you get 5/20ths of a year or 1/4 of a year. So then this number would have gone up by 1/4 of a year. So you can kind of estimate that also if you've got added years. But for the vast majority of people, you don't have added years. That service bit will be static. So what we've now got to do is estimate what your pensionable pay is going to be by the end of 24/25. Now, for people in England where they have been paid their back pay, and for people that have already had any increments, they can use their November payslip. In fact, I think my December payslip actually landed today. But if they use the November payslip, they can take these two values that I've highlighted here. So this value is pensionable pay year to date. So that's the pensionable pay in the first 9 months, or 8 months, sorry. And then this is the pensionable pay for the remainder of the period. Now, this doesn't work if you've had back pay in your current month, and it doesn't work if you're due a pay rise between now and March 25. It also doesn't work if you've not had your back pay at all yet. And for those people, they might need to do a manual calculation. So for example, if we go back to this first page, and let's say you're a consultant in Scotland, and I'll just need to write these down because I'm not as familiar with these. Let's say you'd gone to the top of the pay scale, which is 142,369, and let's say you had or you were expecting a DP6, so that's 21,600. So then you could just manually work that out. Did I have that over here? No, I didn't. So what did we say? 142,369 and 21,600, and equals that plus that. And then if you're full time and then you're expecting it to be 163,969, you could then put that figure in here, which is your estimated actual pensionable pay for that year. But if you're in England, you can use this method. If you're using the December payslip, you can just change this remaining periods to 3 instead of 4. But if you're using the November payslip, I suggested there, it's 4 periods. So down here, we've got previous pensionable pay, and that's this kind of off yellow colour because it's pulled that through from over here, this 136,532 figure. And then we've got the estimated pensionable pay by year end. So this includes, for this consultant, an increment from September, so half a year's worth of increment. So it could have been a lot worse if it was also an increment, for example, from April, and they had the full year effect in the tax year. But you can see the substantial pay growth there, 136 versus 159. And in this tax year, we've not got 10.1% allowable growth. We've got the previous September CPI, which was 6.7%. So whereas last year we had a very large negative number, minus 31, we've now got a very large positive number of 81,327. We've also got a slightly larger 2015 growth because the pensionable pay has gone up, and so that produces a combined PIA of almost 130k. So I'm just going to have a quick drink before we get to the depressing numbers. So let's just assume the same assumption that we used for the previous year. So remember, the previous year we'd said that total taxable pay was 210 and that didn't cause a problem. But for the same member, if they had total taxable pay of 24/25, then they have a big problem all of a sudden, because despite them having that very generous 50,890 carry forward, which is pulled through from that previous page, because of this very large growth, there's been very significant tapering. So instead of having a 60k annual allowance, so last time they had the general and reduced annual allowance, but instead of that being that 60k, this is now reduced down to 20k. And so the consequence of that is they've got a very large bit that they would need to put in box 10 of their tax return in January 2026. And that would cause them, if they were in England as opposed to Scotland, where the marginal rate's even higher, that would cause them a tax charge of 26,455. So I'm just going to write down that number, because we're just going to talk about just two different strategies to try and get that figure down. Now, because we're in December, there's still a bit of time in this tax year to do something about it. And so the two principal things you can do are change your non-pensionable pay. So remember that government example from the Department of Health. Oh, I've lost it now, or closed it, I think, by mistake. Here we are. So if you can kind of come either side of threshold income, you can make a big difference. So if your total taxable income was 210, the tax charge was 26,445. And now let's see, if you drop your income to 199,000, we can see that that's now gone down to 8,503. So that's a difference of, mental maths is a bit slow today, a huge difference, £18,000 almost difference. So you've dropped your pre-tax income by £11,000, your gross income has come down by £11,000, but your post-tax annual allowance charge has come down by £18,000. So for that consultant, a complete no-brainer to try and bring themselves the right side of the taper. Not great for waiting lists, but this is why I think, and I'm very grateful to the Department of Health for doing so. Department of Health are trying to highlight to the DDRB and to Treasury and others that this is really bad for waiting lists, because if you're caught out by this and you've got high pension growth in this tax year, then it's going to be a big problem. Now, there are other strategies that you can use. So let's say we go back to £210,000, and another strategy that you could use is to make a private pension contribution. Now, some of you are thinking, what on earth are you talking about? You've got growth of £129,000 already. Why on earth would you want to make a private pension contribution that would put that growth up? So now let's make a private pension contribution. This is a gross contribution of £11,000, and that has the same effect on threshold income. So yes, the PIA has gone up from 129 to 140, but threshold income is now come down to 199, and that means you've now got the full annual allowance of £60,000, and that tax charge has come down to 13,453. So I think the original one was 26,455. So what's that? That's a difference of £13,000 after tax. So you've made a gross contribution before tax of £11,000 to bring your threshold income down, and your tax charge has come down by £13,000. So a no-brainer, but requires very careful planning to work out exactly what your year-end taxable pay is expected to be, and so that might be best done in conjunction with your accountant, for example, just to try and work out exactly what your taxable pay is going to be, if you're going to try and do that, to try and make sure that your total taxable pay is there. So I've just put that back down to no mitigations. This page just gives a summary of those two tax years. Please do remember, if you put rubbish in, you'll get rubbish out. So this is based entirely on the numbers that you put in. So it will only be as accurate as what you put in. But so that's it as it stands with for that consultant with the existing growth. If the threshold income was 210 in both years, no tax charge in 23-24 when it could go up by 10%, but a very hefty tax charge of £26,000. But for example, if they made a private pension contribution of £11,000, a very different situation with the AA tax charge has come down very significantly. So I'm just going to briefly cover 2008, because 2008 is a much more complicated scheme. It's a very good scheme, and I think probably if I could have my time again and have choice, I probably would choose it. So although some people may not be liking some of the pension grade figures at the moment around 2008, it is a very good scheme. So let's just go back to this original screen and change this to 2008. Now for 23-24, if you've got your TRS, then you've got your reckonable pay figure if you've got your TRS for 22-23 and your TRS for 23-24. And remember, I've told you how to get your previous TRS if you previously accessed it. And if you put in reckonable pay figures up here and actual pay figures down here, and they will be different, they'll always be different. Reckonable pay and actual pay will never be the same. That's not quite true. In your first year, they'd be the same, wouldn't they? But this will give you an accurate picture for 23-24. Where it gets difficult is 24-25. And for 24-25, we've pulled through this reckonable pay figure from the TRS for the 23-24. But then if you're going to use this method to work out your actual pay, and then you're going to use that same actual pay figure here, then that figure is going to be wrong, because, as I said, reckonable pay is never the same as normal pay. Now, this is what the standard method is on the NHS Employers First Actuarial Modeller, and so I validate it against that. And if you want to use this kind of simple approach, where reckonable pay equals actual pay, you will get a very poor estimate, in my opinion, of growth. But that does validate with the current First Actuarial NHS Employers calculator. What I would encourage you to consider doing, and it will take a bit more of your time, but it also might help you learn about reckonable pay, because reckonable pay is a bit of a nightmare, is use this tab, which is the detailed reckonable pay tab. Okay, so this is a completely different consultant, and reflecting, I think, that the demographic for 2008 consultants is often very different to 1995 consultants, because they're often much younger, and therefore some of their recent pay is much more likely to be as a registrar. So, for example, reckonable pay needs 10 years of data. Yeah. So for this line at the top that's got 10 years of data, these will give accurate figures. For ones where you've got less than 10 years data, it's probably still going to give you the same figures. But if you had a very high pay 9 years ago, before 21-22, then this estimate won't work. But for the vast majority of people where pay goes up each year, which it generally does, these figures will be accurate. And so you can actually get all of these figures from those two TRSs that we said at the beginning. So if you've got a 22-23 tax, if you've got a 22-23 TRS, that has got all of your pensionable pay figures from 15-16 through to 22-23. You can then add your 23-24 figure from your 22-23-24 TRS, and then you can then use this estimator to work out what your estimated actual pay is going to be, because remember, this only works out your actual pay and not your reckonable pay. But if you put all of that in, so I've just kind of guesstimated here, so these are real figures for an actual person, and I've just kind of guesstimated that in 24-25 it's gone from 103 to 120 for this particular member, so it went up by 16%. You can see how it's very different to the 1995 schemes. The 1995 scheme essentially looks at changes to your actual pay. So you can see for the relevant 3 years here, this member's actual pay has gone up by 2.5%, 13.8% and 16%, but their reckonable pay bears absolutely no resemblance to that. So 23.6%, 18% and 9.7%. And that's because of one of the good features of the 2008 scheme is it's got averaging, and it's also got inflation protection. So I think for this member, actually, the reckonable pay has always been the most recent 3-year average, but I've definitely seen some on recent TRSs that I've been sent over the weekend when I first started looking at this in more detail, where it can be previous years, you know, the 21-22 tax year, and then there's been a big spike, and then that it is held in the reckonable pay. So again, the intention is that you can check these reckonable pay figures. So if you put in all this data correctly, then this reckonable pay figure should match the reckonable pay figure shown on the 2008 section of a TRS for somebody in that scheme. And then you can take these green figures, which are actual pay and reckonable pay, and put them into the rest of the modeler. And that essentially is it. So please don't be too depressed about the prospect of having to estimate. It's not an ideal position at all that we've been put in. For people that haven't got an RPSS, it's very difficult, and your estimate will not be correct because you don't know the correct carry forward. For people that have got an RPSS, and particularly people that have paid pension tax charges before, so they fail triage and can get this dealt with by free, there's some links in here so you can get through the other side of that process and know your carry forward and work all of this out correctly. But I hope that just gives people just a little bit of a guide of what 23, 24 and 24, 25 tax looks like. And I think the kind of take-home message for consultants, generally 23, 24, you will have big negative growth if nothing unusual has happened, like you've had an increment. But generally your pay went down in real terms, you've got negative PIA, and against the new allowance, that should mean that you don't have a tax charge for 23, 24, but you need to run the numbers. You can't just use that generalisation. HMRC are expecting you to estimate it. And then for the 24, 25 tax year, particularly for people that do get stung by pension tax with tapering, so I'll just take that mitigation out there from getting a private pension, there might be some very big tax charges indeed for people that get caught out by that. So please just do consider if there's anything you can do, if you're close enough to the taper to do something about it, to try and minimise that charge. Please, again, just carefully read all of the bump in the red box at the beginning. In particular, it will not work for people that have been in and out of the scheme since 2022, and those people are going to need to probably get professional advice if they want to try and estimate accurately what their pension tax charges are, because it just becomes much more difficult when you come in and out of the scheme. And generally, coming in and out of the scheme is not the right thing to do. Just as a general rule, you're generally better staying in, trying to reduce your pension tax via other ways. For example, the two examples that I've given here about by not tapering, and then just paying scheme pays, which I know is not ideal, particularly if you're younger and a long way away from retirement. But I guess all that remains is for me to wish people a Merry Christmas and season's greeting, or Happy Hanukkah, or whatever you celebrate, and a very happy New Year for next year. And please do feedback if you detect any problems with the tool. And I'll just kind of go back to the front page for the links, because I'm just aware that I've not put that in the video, but the links are in here. So the main one for the tool is bit.ly/Goldstone 2325 PIA, and then the other ones are in there. Many thanks for your attention. I probably will be doing something at the weekend just to cover it off, and any kind of questions or initial feedback from people. But feel free to leave comments on Twitter and share with colleagues who are in a similar mess with this. Many thanks, everyone. Cheers all.